Hi, everyone. Good morning. This is Andrea Marson, and I'm an Equal Justice Works Fellow in the Elder Justice Program here at the Maryland Volunteer Lawyer Service, or MVLS. This week is Pro Bono Week, and I'm so happy you're joining us so you can better assist clients facing problems with their reverse mortgages. Please note that this presentation is recorded, with both the PowerPoint and the recording posted on the MVLS website. You can find the slides and a tax credit application right now in the handout section of GoToWebinar. Feel free to type questions into the chat box, and we'll also have some time at the end of this hour for Q&A. Our panelists today are two expert attorneys at the Maryland Legal Aid Bureau. Louise Carwell is a senior attorney for consumer law, and she teaches consumer protection at the University of Maryland Carey School of Law. William Steinwittel is a staff attorney in the Foreclosure Legal Assistance Project, and he also presents widely on housing and bankruptcy. We are so thrilled to have Mr. Steinwittel and Ms. Carwell here with us, and I will let them take it away.
Thank you, Andrea, so much. Bill and I are going to share this presentation, and I will be doing the first few slides, and then Bill will do the rest of the presentation. If you have any questions, please do put them into the chat, and you also will have our contact information at the end of the training in case you wish to contact us. We're happy to answer any questions. As you see on the first slide, I just wanted, Bill and I just want to set out what the training will cover so that you have some sense of it. We'll talk about what a reverse mortgage is, the law that applies, when a homeowner can apply for a reverse mortgage, problems that homeowners face, and some problems we have seen, and then how to resolve them, both through negotiations or defending against a foreclosure case, and that includes the bankruptcy option. And I want to say the fancy slide techniques are Bill Steinwittel's. He is wonderful at that. So any fancy things you see, that is totally Bill. Hi, sorry. The reverse mortgage is sort of a slang term for what is more properly called a home equity conversion mortgage, or a HECM. And once an individual who is a homeowner reaches the age of 62, if they have equity in their home that is sufficient, then they can take out a mortgage which pays off any remaining liens on the property, and then they get to live the rest of their life, as long as they live in the house, using, not having to pay a mortgage. And then if there are some funds that have been made available by them taking out that type of reverse loan, they live mortgage free. The older the person is, the more they can borrow against the equity in their home. And so at Maryland Legal Aid, we tend to find that those who take out reverse mortgages are those folks who want to stay in their home. They don't necessarily want to give their homes to any heirs. They don't feel that they can really still afford a mortgage payment. And they may have a lot of bills that they hope the reverse mortgage and the equity in their house will pay off. So they will not have those things to worry about anymore. Next slide. So there are requirements for the homeowner once they take out the reverse mortgage. They do have to continue to pay their property taxes. If they have a homeowners association monthly fee, they are responsible for that. If they have a ground rent, they are responsible for that. And they have to keep insurance on the property. I'll just note this is sometimes a problem for a homeowner. They don't recognize or realize that they have to continue making these payments. Or the older they get, the less able they are able to remember that these are things that they've got to pay, and especially if they don't have anyone to help them, remind them about bill paying, this can get behind. They also have to keep the home in good shape. So if there are housing violations that are noted against the property, that could be a problem with their reverse mortgage. So I want to note that. I also want to note that the process of taking out a reverse mortgage, there is counseling that is required, and some counselors are better than others. And so a lot of borrowers don't really understand exactly what they're doing and exactly all the costs and the responsibilities. If an individual passes away who is the borrower, then the home will be sold either at a foreclosure auction, or it is offered to any heirs, and if the heirs are able to come up with 95% of the fair market value at that time, then they can purchase the property. Just a note here, I find that reverse lenders often will overassess the value of the property, and so when the time comes for heirs to look to see if they're able to afford to purchase the property, the 95% of the fair market value may be significantly lower than the balance on the mortgage. So they shouldn't be put off by the fact that there's this huge mortgage balance. They may be able to actually afford to buy the property. Next slide. So just to understand the financial structure, when you take out a mortgage, you know up front from your truth in lending disclosures what the final cost will be at the end of the mortgage and how much your payments are and what the interest rate is, and you're going to have a balance of 0 at the end of your mortgage. A reverse mortgage is a very different animal. You start out with an amount that you are borrowing, which is a lien on your house, which you do not have to repay, but that amount grows. It does not decrease, and that's because interest is being added on. And so over time, that balance increases. And so at the time the borrower dies, that balance will be more usually than they borrowed. There are also these what are called origination fees on reverse mortgages that really tend to be very high. If you ever look at a lending document called the HUD-1 in a reverse mortgage, you will see that there are lots of costs and fees that are associated with a reverse mortgage that are a lot more than if you were purchasing a home. The borrower usually does not do any kind of negotiation about trying to reduce those. They don't recognize those often. They don't realize they're being charged those, even though they will probably receive the HUD-1 ahead of time. They are just what they are, and they just let them go. So companies that deal with these reverse mortgages usually make a pretty good profit at the very beginning of these. And the reverse mortgages are completely regulated and underwritten by the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development. So there are no private reverse mortgages. Just a note on that, lenders, If they come up short, if they have to foreclose on a property, they will go back to HUD and say, we have, we lost out on this mortgage and we want that balance repaid to us. And that often will happen. Just as a side note, this has resulted in lawsuits being filed against reverse mortgage companies for filing false claims due to the fact that at the very inception of the mortgage, the properties were overvalued. And so there would be no way that the reverse mortgage company would ever make back that profit. And they are now coming back to the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development for that bad investment. So that's just something that we always keep in the back of our mind. I think it is also important before someone ever enters into a reverse mortgage that they do some reading on it. AARP has wonderful information on their website for free on reverse mortgages that I think is very fair and balanced, and they should take a look at it before they sign on the dotted line if that's really what they want to do. Next slide. So there are several statutes that you should consider when you have a reverse mortgage case. Certainly federal truth in lending. And I always, if you're not familiar with truth in lending, the regulations, which are the most helpful in explaining the statute, are at Regulation Z. And so I have set out where those regulations are. RESPA, the Federal Real Estate Settlement Procedures Act, comes into play, and Regulation X. Maryland has a statute regarding reverse mortgages that was passed in 2010, I believe. And then there may be some other types of statutes that become involved if the collection comes into place or lending. So one would be the Federal Fair Debt Collection Practices Act. The other is ECOA, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. If mortgage lending is being inappropriately offered in certain communities. By inappropriate, I mean not being offered as equally as it would in other communities. And then there are other certainly state and federal statutes that you may think may apply, such as our state Unfair and Deceptive Trading Trade Practices Act or lending laws, state lending laws. Next slide. So a couple other resources that may be helpful to you. HUD has what's called the HUD Handbook. And if you go to the website from NRMLA, they will connect you with that. And that's actually from the National Reverse Mortgage Lenders website. The HUD Handbook is very helpful in explaining the procedures and the regulations as to reverse lending. So it's a good thing to read and take a look at. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which is the federal agency that oversees reverse mortgages and any type of loan, also has some helpful information on the website I've put on this slide. Consumers can also file complaints on this website, and it's a fairly easy complaint portal. And then the Maryland Commission of Financial Regulation has this pamphlet that I have placed the PDF website for you, and they will also take complaints as well. Next slide. So here Bill is going to chime in a little bit. You may have seen reverse mortgage ads on TV. So Bill, why don't you chime in here and talk a little bit about those advertisements?
Yes, hello, this is William Steinwhittle. I work at the I work at Maryland Legal Aid Bureau, the Foreclosure Legal Assistance Project. So I do a lot of work with reverse mortgages. And perfectly honest, when I asked people, how they found out about reverse mortgages, most of them it was from a TV commercial. Um, whatever. I have a lot of issues with the reverse mortgage industry, but one of the things that they're extraordinarily good at is advertising. I mean, they have managed to find like the least threatening celebrity from every demographic when that demographic reaches 62 to promote their product. The current one, for a long time, it was James Gardner, who was Jim Rockford on the Rockford Files, which for people of my of the World War II generation, my grandparents' generation, that was sort of the nice down home TV guy. And in the sort of early 2000s, it was Fred Thompson, from Law and Order, and former senator of Tennessee, and the Fonz, Henry Winkler. And now, as sort of the generation's a little bit older than my parents, but sort of getting there, it's Tom Selleck, who is the Marlboro Man, Magnum PI, Mr. Baseball, totally non-threatening guy telling you, hey, this is totally a great product. You need to buy it. There's no downsides, blah, blah, blah. So as I always say, that I guess if I'm lucky enough to make it to 62 and 65, that when I get there, it'll be John Cena and Jim from The Office selling reverse mortgages to me, because they're the most non-threatening people that I could think of from my generation that would obviously be selling this product, because that's just, as I said, they put a lot of money into advertising, and they invest heavily, because that is where they get their bang for their buck. That is where they get people to buy these products. Now, they are supposed to go through a financial counseling with a HUD certified financial counselor before they take on this product, but they can vary in usefulness. There is, in fact, one of the HUD counselors that we're fairly close to in this state said that there's only 3 HUD certified counselors in the entire state of Maryland. So, a lot of these people, they do phone calls out of state, it's a 20-minute phone call and then you're free to go. So some people that have this HUD certification take this very seriously, and some don't. So, it's supposed to be a check on this, just, falling for, deceptive or, exaggerated, misleading advertising, but sometimes it does not serve the purpose it needs to. Next slide. And I think I'm turning it back to Louise now.
Okay, thank you, Bill. So normally the cases that we see at Maryland Legal Aid arrive because of a default or alleged default, but there can certainly be other reasons why. So if there is a default, it's because these reverse mortgages usually do not have an escrow account associated with them, or there was an escrow account and the payment is lacking, and that's because that amount hasn't been paid in. The abuse in the reverse mortgage origination process can occur. We've touched on a few. But often what we will also see is that a family member was able to convince an individual homeowner to sign up for a reverse mortgage, and then the family member took advantage of that person and took off with the money. So you will find sometimes an elderly person who really has no idea that they're in a reverse mortgage. After they go to settlement, if there is a mortgage balance on the house that's been paid off, then the person has the option of taking a lump sum for whatever money may be remaining, or they can also have a line of credit that they can borrow against, or they can simply set aside that amount against any future costs. In my experience, I've seen all kinds of ways that folks have used that money. Some have borrowed against it. I had one person who took it all at once, $75,000, and she went on a cruise, bought presents for herself and her family, used it up in about 3 months, and that was that. That was her money, that was her choice, that was her goal. So she knew exactly what she was doing with that. Is that the wisest choice? Maybe not for you and me, but that's what she wanted to do. So you'll find that happens. Obviously, the most concerning are those folks who didn't realize they were in a reverse mortgage, or if the costs that were charged at the time of origination are really abusive or more than they should be, and really what the borrower understood. And often, as Bill noted, that counseling session in 20 minutes, a person may really not appreciate really what they're getting into and really what those costs are going to be. Next slide. So those of you who are familiar with mortgages know that most mortgage companies do not collect the funds themselves these days, and they do not do any communication necessarily with the homeowner. There are servicers that do that, and that's for reverse mortgages and all other types of mortgage. So we have a list here of reverse mortgage servicers, and some servicers are better than others. Is important. If your client is in trouble, that you get a release from them so you can talk with the reverse mortgage servicer, so you can send them a RESPA letter if there are issues involved in problems with, for example, defaults or deficiencies, so you can try to get that information from the very beginning and see what it is exactly that the servicer is claiming and why.
Louise, I also put this slide. I just wanted to comment that I put this slide in because a lot of the people who get all the people that get reverse mortgages are elderly, so sometimes they don't understand like why they're in foreclosure. So I put this in so attorneys and people that are assisting these people would see, these companies, there are clues that you're dealing with a reverse mortgage and not a standard, deed of trust mortgage or, some kind of government-backed mortgage. These are reverse mortgage servicers, and most exclusively outside of the exception of Wells Fargo. So that's why I included this, so that people would see these names and sort of figure out what was going on.
Thank you, Bill. Yes. And you will find from time to time these servicers change as companies combine, change names, go out of business, that sort of thing. As those of you who do any type of foreclosure prevention work will know, there's currently a moratorium on federally insured mortgages. So those have been suspended until December 31st of this year. And so we have that in place. It may be that extension goes on longer past that time. We'll just have to wait and see a little bit to see what happens with that. But as we have in this slide, HUD has also permitted for a homeowner or their heir in which the entire loan has become due and payable to request an extension to cure any amount that it is claimed they owe. So that's a little bit different situation than in normal times when you're seeing a foreclosure that's been filed and it's coming towards a time when that foreclosure date will occur. Currently, that it can't move forward. So some options to resolve the default, and once you have a good sense, or maybe you don't have a good sense, at least initially, of what's going on, when there is a default, it is because If it is correct, the borrower hasn't complied with a term of the reverse mortgage. So can be failure to keep their property insured, it can be not paying their property taxes, it can be that they have not submitted what's called an occupancy certificate, because they do have to live in the home. If they move out of the home, or if they're very ill and they go into a nursing home, for example, then they are in default under the reverse mortgage, and the lender can move forward to initiate foreclosure. There are other ways to deal with defaults, certainly a repayment plan if it's a matter of taxes or insurance that haven't been paid. You can do, if you can pay it up all at once, then the homeowner can simply pay the money and fix the problem. And then there's something called an at-risk extension. If you'll go to the next slide. Okay, I think that will be in the next one. Hold on just a minute. Just to touch on property taxes, if the amount is below $2,000, for the most part, servicers will not move forward with a foreclosure. They will enter into a repayment plan with the individual. In Maryland, if you don't know, and I think Bill will touch on this later, there is a program for individuals who are low income to be able to reduce their yearly property taxes by filing for a homeowner's property tax credit. And if they're over the age of 70 and they've never done that type of application before, they can get retroactive credits for prior years. If it's an issue of providing proof of insurance or an occupancy certificate, then that can be done fairly soon and quickly by simply having an affidavit that they do reside in the property. You may want to have additional proof of that, such as mail that's going to their house, for example, and proof of insurance. If that's the problem, if you can obtain proof of insurance, that will end the foreclosure case. Next slide. So the repayment plan, they are not guaranteed by any provision of HUD, but generally these are repayment plans that can be proposed over 3 to 5 years. But during that time, the homeowner still needs to continue to pay their property taxes and insurance that comes due in the year that they are in. So they must stay current with those as well. They apply for the repayment plan with the mortgage servicer. If the property value has dropped, HUD has instructed servicers not to offer repayment plans. So that will be a reason to consider some other options if the servicer will deny this type of repayment plan, and that's where Bill's discussion of bankruptcy would come into play. So now we're at this at-risk medical extension slide that I touched on earlier. If a homeowner is over 80 and they have a medical hardship, then they can apply for this at-risk medical extension. They get a letter from their doctor regarding the fact that they have a medical hardship. It defers the foreclosure for a year, and then they can renew the extension every year as long as the homeowner is alive. Sometimes you want to attach a budget letter. So just to be clear, if someone is facing foreclosure and they meet the age of 80 and they have a medical hardship and they can get a letter from their doctor, this will put off a foreclosure. The idea being you have an individual in a reverse mortgage. It is for individuals who are elderly, and this is a financial product that's supposed to help individuals who are elderly. So you don't want to be in a situation where you're putting them out of their home, especially if they are ill. There are situations where the individual decides that they don't want to remain in the property. They can simply leave the property. They can decide to turn the property back over to the lender in what's called a deed in lieu of foreclosure. They can also try to do a short sale, although it is most common that there is no equity in the property, so they're not going to be able to salvage anything. And even in a short sale situation, the deficiency would be very large, so that may not be acceptable to the lender. And the other problem with both of these is that if the person needs help with moving to a new place, it's not offered by the servicer as part of the deed in lieu. So this may or may not be something that an individual wishes to consider. So now Bill's going to talk about reverse mortgages and bankruptcy tools that may be helpful to homeowners who are facing foreclosure and they are not able to offer or get a type of satisfactory repayment option with the lender.
Yes. So I do a lot of bankruptcies and a lot of reverse mortgage bankruptcies. The one thing I want to tell people, attorneys that are going to be taking these cases, is that a reverse mortgage bankruptcy is different than a standard, and a reverse mortgage default and a foreclosure is different than a standard mortgage foreclosure on a normal 30-year deed of trust. Mainly, the big difference is a reverse mortgage foreclosure could happen after 1 property tax default or 10. Like, when the reverse mortgage servicer decides to move forward is not common. You know, normally if you're dealing with a deed of trust, after a certain 6 to 8 month default period, they're going to move forward. But with the reverse mortgages, they can wait years. They'll let the person pay for a little while and they'll keep it just low enough that they don't want to go forward. And then all of a sudden they'll want to go forward. So it's kind of hard. So in a lot of these cases, it's very important to figure out what the total default is and what the default resulted from. In regards to insurance issues and things like that. But, if you have determined that there is going to be a default due to property taxes and insurance, and there's no other option to cure it that works for the individual, a Chapter 13 is good to consider. They can be very effective. If you could go to the next slide. The reason why they can be very effective in these kind of cases is because the default isn't that large, because again, property taxes, even in the most wealthy counties, and we're going to talk about property tax credits in a couple seconds, but it's only $6,000 to $7,000 a year. So if it's only 2 to 3 years, you're talking maybe about a $15,000 to $20,000 default, which is very manageable in a Chapter 13 because you're paying it over 60 months. But unlike a deed of trust default, which could be, even within a year in some of these Prince George's County defaults and wealthier counties, you're talking $40,000 to $50,000 is not out of the realm of possibility. So they're much easier to manage in the Chapter 13. You can also avoid liens. For those of you that do bankruptcy, you can avoid liens in a Chapter 13 as long as you establish the reverse mortgage has eliminated all of the equity. The hardest thing with the reverse mortgage bankruptcy is the post-petition issues, property taxes and insurance, and making sure they're maintained throughout the years. Because it's likely that if your client has fallen behind before, either because they let their insurance lapse or because they didn't pay their property taxes, they're likely to do it again. So in a lot of these cases, you're constantly keeping them alive by dealing with motions for relief from stay, which is when a person falls behind on their post-petition responsibilities in regards to the home, or an affidavit of default, which would come after that. So that's why what I'm going to talk about in the next slide, which is the property tax credits, are so important. So the homeowner property tax credit is available to all homeowners in the current fiscal tax year, which is fiscal year 2021. Unfortunately, to make this confusing unnecessarily, so basically the fiscal year is 6 months of the current year and then 6 months of the next year. So we are currently in fiscal year 2021. Next year, in June 2021, we'll be in fiscal year 2022. So sometimes that confuses our clients that they'll say, I did my tax return. I was like, no, you did it for last year. They're misunderstanding that you haven't done it for this year yet. For homeowners over 70, however, they can apply retroactively for property tax credits going back 3 years. So this year it would be 2020, 2019, and 2018. That would be the so they can go back 3 years. So it would be fiscal year 2021, fiscal year 2020, and fiscal year 2019. The other thing is you may want to check, and I just had to deal with this with a client, is you may want to see if, as Louise had said, a lot of times they overvalue these properties. So you may want to get a reassessment. That will not help them currently, but it may help them going forward if they overassess the property when they originated the reverse mortgage. You may want to request a reassessment from SSTAT. So the property tax credit can serve two purposes in a Chapter 13. If you're already in a Chapter 13, it can keep the Chapter 13 going good. It can keep it, from falling into a motion for relief and stay or a default. If you're about to get into a Chapter 13, if you do your retroactive property tax credits, it could bring down the amount that your client has to pay in the Chapter 13. A word of caution, however, this happened to me more than once. If the client is in default, it's likely that the servicer has paid the property taxes for recent years. So if that's happened, if they get credits, then they're not going to go back and figure out who the state and the county aren't going to go figure out who paid who. So they'll just send your client a check saying, we don't have any taxes owed for this period, so here's your check. And then sometimes and before I was doing a lot of these, the clients would spend some of the money, but you have to tell them, no, we need, especially if they're in a Chapter 13, we need to take that money and give it right to the trustee. Now I've had them actually just bring the checks to like a meeting of creditors, and then if the trustee allows it, I'll just have them forward it over to them to contribute to their plan, and that works very well. Next slide. So that's sort of Chapter 13s and reverse mortgages. I mean, there's a lot of moving parts. A lot of cases are very different. So our emails are included in this slideshow at the end. Please contact me if you have questions about Chapter 13 reverse mortgage cases. But that's the basics. You create the plan, you pay the default to the reverse mortgage company, and make sure post-petition defaults do not occur. In reverse mortgages in Chapter 7, so in a Chapter 7, a reverse mortgage is the same as a regular mortgage. It counts against the equity. It's likely that if you're filing a Chapter 7 for somebody in a reverse mortgage, they probably don't have any equity remaining in the home. However, and the lien stays and it can ride through. Also, a Chapter 7 doesn't help cure a reverse mortgage default, just like it doesn't help cure a standard 30-year deed of trust default. However, there has been one case where I've gotten this to work, and I've seen other cases where this has worked. We generally don't want to get people in reverse mortgages, but there are a few exceptions where they can be helpful. In one particular case, in this case, we filed a Chapter 7 to avoid a imminent foreclosure, and the client wanted to stay in her home. So basically what we did was we got her a reverse mortgage and basically paid off the Chapter 7 trustee. Again, there has to be significant equity in the home. We paid off the Chapter 7 trustee and basically allowed her to stay in the home through a Chapter 7. Next slide. So basically the Chapter 7 trustee becomes another lien holder that you have to pay through the Chapter 7. you go through the reverse mortgage originator. We do have some that we trust, and if you run into a case that's similar where they have significant equity but no real opportunity to pay the mortgage and they really don't want to move, you can reach out to me and I can give you the contact information for people that we believe aren't going to take advantage of your clients. And then you basically file a motion with the bankruptcy court to get the reverse mortgage approved. The loan goes to settlement and everyone gets paid and your client gets to stay in the home. Usually we also advise that the client do, Louise didn't mention this, there's something called a set aside. Basically, you can set aside a certain amount of what you would get normally in a lump sum or line of credit to pay off future property taxes and insurance. We advise if we do help a client originate a reverse mortgage, that they do that. And basically that way they don't have to worry about the insurance or the property taxes, or if there's an HOA, they don't have to worry about any of it. So basically they're just living in the house free of charge. All they have to do is maintain their insurance, not pay it, just maintain, make sure they still have it, and then they're good to go. So it works out very well. But again, you have to work hard with the client, you have to set it up, and you have to work, with a reputable reverse mortgage originator. Next slide. So this was the real life example. Again, she didn't want to sell, she wanted to stay in the home. The reason is, and her dog was a lot smaller, but I'm a fan of bigger dogs, so she didn't want to leave. She didn't want to leave. She didn't want to go to an apartment. She didn't think they would accept the dog, her dog. So she wanted to stay because her dog was very important to her. So we figure out a way to allow it to happen. So sometimes you have to get creative with these things. But as I said, generally reverse mortgages are not what people want to do, but they can be helpful in limited circumstances. But again, the focus of this is curing the default through a Chapter 13, but you may have to get creative if a person has a lot of equity but no real ability to save the home. Next slide. That picture is from the movie Heaven Can Wait. So what happens when the borrower dies, and what happens? It doesn't just, this happens all the time. Like somebody dies and nobody knows what's going to occur if they had a reverse mortgage. So we're going to go through now what happens. Next slide. Also, I did want to mention that the property tax credit application for this year is part of the documents provided for this presentation. It's a fairly simple application, but it is provided. And if you have any questions, you can also email me or call me about any questions you have in regards to filling out the application. So the way a reverse mortgage works is when the last borrower dies on a reverse mortgage, the entire mortgage becomes due. The whole mortgage. The heirs, unless they are a non-borrowing spouse, cannot assume the responsibility of the mortgage. Believe me, I've had this conversation until I was blue in my face with many people who inherited the properties. They cannot assume the responsibilities of the mortgage. They are not permitted, period. Again, we'll talk about non-borrowing spouse. That's the one exception to the rule, but generally they cannot. The only right that they have is to purchase the property back either by satisfying the entire mortgage or paying back 95% of the fair market value of the day of death, whichever is lower. Louise was correct. Generally, the 95% is usually lower, but not always. But it's generally the lower of the two numbers. Again, the other thing is some people think that they can get around this by creating a life estate with a remainder. For those of you that do a lot of estate work and trust work, that doesn't do anything. HUD has issued a specific guideline saying all that does is allow you to avoid probate, but it does not do anything in regards to the reverse mortgage. It is still there and they still have the same rights. In the entire time I've been doing this, and we're now getting into 7-8 years, I've only seen one person actually be able to purchase the property for 95% of the fair market value. And that was only because her husband it was the granddaughter of the last borrower. She was the heir to the property and her husband could get a loan. That was why. But it's pretty hard to do because you got to come up with the financing really fast. Just in case you're curious, what happens if you can do it is it works like a short sale. Basically, the reverse mortgage company sells the heir back the property in sort of a short sale format. So you go to settlement and all that. I've actually been there. It's very interesting, but that's how it works. But just out of curiosity, but it is very hard to do. Next slide. The one exception is something called non-borrower spouse relief. So at first there was no exception. That, you know, even if you're a non-borrower spouse, when the person died, 95% or you're out of the house, they're going to take. Well, the problem is that, and again, this isn't being stereotypical or any way, generally in our society, men tend to die before women. So a lot of widows whose husbands died, all of a sudden were like, I have this reverse mortgage, and they were getting thrown out of their house. And this was very bad publicity for HUD. In addition, it came out that a lot of the servicers were, so basically this would be the situation, and this happens all the time. So let's say the husband's 64 and the wife is 60. And they're both on the property. So if you want to originate a reverse mortgage, all the owners of the property have to be over 62. If one of them is under 62, they can't do it. So what these unscrupulous originators would say is, wink, wink, why don't you transfer the deed to just your husband, and then we can do this, and you'll get this great gift of this financial product, and you'll make all this money, blah, 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 what the sales pitch again. The problem is, and then all of a sudden, once the husband dies, the wife has to leave the house. So this was horrible publicity for HUD. People were getting removed from older women were getting removed from their homes, mostly women getting removed from the homes. It was very bad. So the DC, basically a bunch of these widows got a lawyer, always a good idea, and basically sued, and it got all the way to the DC Circuit Court of Appeals, I believe, and they said, and all the court said was, we're not going to allow them to be evicted. HUD, you need to fix this, and you need to fix this now. And we're going to say they can assume the mortgage, and you got to figure out how they can do it. So basically what HUD did after 2014 was that they allowed a non-borrower spouse to assume the responsibilities on the mortgage, but they had to do certain things within 90 days of the date of death, which is really hard, especially if you don't know what you're doing. And also another thing, it does not apply if they got married after the borrower entered the reverse mortgage. So the first question you ask if it's a non-borrower spouse case is, when did you marry? And then you look at the origination date for the reverse mortgage. If it's after that, if this is like a second marriage, you're out. Like, it doesn't work. You can't do it. So it was for a long time very strenuous, very strict, the 90 days, and there wasn't a lot of flexibility. And believe me, I litigated this in a couple of cases, and that's what the regulation stated for years. But eventually they realized this was probably too harsh. Because one of the requirements was that within 90 days of the date of death, you had to get the property in your name. And if you've ever had to deal with land records, if you do a lot of that, that can be very hard to do, even if you're making an extremely quick effort to do it. So they recently changed it with a new regulation, and now it's 180 days of date of death. They need to provide the marriage certificate, proof of insurance, proof of property taxes, and utilities, a couple other things, proof of utilities paid, things like that. However, the title doesn't have to be in their name. They just have to be in the process of doing it. So that does sort of lessen the burden. I will say, on top of that, though, in regards to the non-borrower spouse, a marriage certificate, especially for an older person, can be very hard to find. I once represented a person who had immigrated from this country. I believe they were from India. They had to call the Indian book of records or whatever, and then they get a certificate, or they had to call immigration and get their original state. It can be very hard, so keep that in mind. That's another thing of what is asked for that can be very difficult to get, especially if it's a person who's immigrated to the United States, or especially if it's a person where it's they got married in 1962 or 1963 years ago. It's very difficult. Basically how it works is, once you get the relief and everyone's on board, they sign the agreement and they become the new borrower on the loan. And then that stays, and then they can stay until they die, and then go back to the same, revert to the same issue in regards to heirs. I don't want to get into this too much, but I did want to mention, with everything that's going on, unfortunately, reverse mortgages are not immune from the discrimination that exists in a lot of parts of our society. And USA Today did a great investigation which focused on Baltimore amongst other issues, amongst other major cities where reverse mortgage originators did target minority communities for the originations of these products. It was especially true in sort of right after the housing crisis, sort of like 2009 to like 2014, because basically mortgage originators were having a lot of issues originating normal, standard mortgages. So they sort of went into this as sort of like a market diversification and then use this as a way to continue to get money. DiTech was a big, that's why you'll see a lot of reverse mortgage solutions servicing on these loans. These reverse mortgage solutions was the reverse mortgage subsidiary of DiTech Financial, which is currently in Chapter 11 because of all the problems they've had. And they were using that to sort of prop up their business. So it's a very interesting article. I urge everyone to read it. Next slide. So we did include some examples. Both of these examples, especially this one, was based on a case that I actually did work on. So unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on the way you look at it, I guess, I've represented quite a few, generally, again, not being certain, generally male clients who are, older, and a younger, generally female friend comes in and sort of starts helping them, but then sort of starts not helping them. So basically, in this situation, this was based on a real case I had. I had a client who was over 80, and this female friend who he swore, and swore even when I was in the hearing that it was his girlfriend, was taking, his money and taking his stuff, and he fell behind on his reverse mortgage. He was disabled. He had suffered some, mental health as well as physical health issues. Luckily for him, in this case, I believe it was a relative came and saw what was going on and was trying to remove the friend from the picture. So what we did, and as Louise went over, was the at-risk extension, and it worked out very well. But that's what you would do, when a client's over 80, that's one of the first things you look at, especially if the default is so large that it doesn't look like they could pay it back, or if a bankruptcy may be difficult. You also have to remember a bankruptcy requires, while you do a lot of the work, does require your client to do some things. And you may want to consider, especially for your clients over 80, if bankruptcy is really mentally plausible for them. I've run into issues where clients have sort of mentally declined over time. And since the bankruptcy, remember, is a 5-year repayment plan, there's a big difference between being 81 and 86 for some people, and 82 and 84. I'm not saying I would never do it, but you have to take that into consideration, especially if a person's already starting to slip physically and mentally, if that's really a good investment and really a good idea. Next slide. So this is not based on any, it's based on sort of an amalgamation of cases, but not a one in particular. This example is more of your classic sort of Chapter 13 situation, where they haven't done their tax credits, they're behind, but they have some income, either a pension or Social Security or both. And they have a fair amount of income, but it's not working out. This is where you use the restructuring of the Chapter 13 to sort of get the person to pay back the default over the course of time. You help them apply for their property tax credits, both for this year and retroactively, and make sure that they take that lump sum and give it to the trustee. So this sort of fact pattern is just sort of your traditional Chapter 13 reverse mortgage fact pattern that you're going to see. Next slide.
Oh, sorry to just jump in here, Mr. Steinwittel. Thank you so much for presenting. I'm just going to go through a few of MBLS's offerings and upcoming trainings. If we probably have time for 1 or 2 questions, if anyone wants to put one in the chat box, and we'll read them afterwards. So if anyone's not familiar with MBLS, we would urge you to take a case. It's very easy for attorneys. clients call our intake specialists. They take down what their situation is, and you can review the facts and see if you can help. We have past trainings on all kinds of subjects that have enormously helped me, and this one will also be posted. And then we have 2 upcoming trainings regarding taxes, the 10th and the 18th of next month. And so here, I've also put it in the chat box, the contact information of our wonderful presenters today. I don't see any questions in the chat box, so I'll ask one to the 2 of you. For the at-risk hardship exemption, people over 80, do you ever have an issue going to doctors and getting that certificate, or is it a fairly flexible definition of what a health condition is?
Well, I will say that the servicers are extremely flexible in regards to what they accept as a medical hardship. Like, I've never seen one rejected that wasn't bad enough, so to speak. I mean, they've generally, even ones where I'm like, man, that person's in pretty good health, I'm not too far behind them, and they'll be like, yeah, medical hardship. So there isn't a big sort of pushback from the servicers. Remember, the one thing Louise didn't comment on is all the medical hardship applications are directly approved by HUD. Like, the servicers sort of process the paperwork, but HUD is the ultimate signing authority off. You know, they do consult with the servicers, but HUD is the ultimate sign-off authority, and they really don't deny them very often. The bigger issue is I actually have represented clients that are in their 90s, and some of them are at the point where they're like, and they don't have a lot of family help, where they could barely like communicate what we need. Like, and then we try to communicate with the doctors, and then you run into HIPAA issues. Like, it gets kind of confusing. Like, one time, one of my colleagues had to, in obviously the pre-COVID era, had to go to the doctor's office with the client to get that letter, because she had to explain to the doctor what we needed, and because of HIPAA, the doctor couldn't just fax it to us. Like, so that's usually the biggest issue with the at-risk extension. Sometimes the clients are so far gone, and they don't have a lot of familial help, that you kind of need to help them even get that little bit of information, because they can't explain it correctly to the doctor. I once had to give the client okay, this is the letter, get your doctor to write something like this, like, because they didn't understand what I was saying, you know. So I had to give them sort of like a form letter to sort of give them an idea of what, of course I wasn't, but it gave the doctor an idea what we needed in return.
And I think, Andrea, with an appropriate release that your client signs, you may be able to, with the form letter, with your client on the phone, you may be able to get someone at the doctor's office or the doctor to talk with all of us, so we can get what the client needs.
Got it. Well, that's great advice. Thank you so much for your time, and also your continued time, because I'm sure you're going to get questions from the lawyers on the line and people who watch this in the future. So thank you again to our presenters, and have a great day.
Thank you, everybody.
It was a pleasure.